Peter, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Ben.
I know this is the first time that we've had kind of a significant conversation about politics and other issues, but I wanted to start off by just sort of saying, you've obviously been someone who's gotten a lot of heat in terms of your experience in politics, and I wondered if that heat that you've experienced has soured you on American politics in general. I think it's a hard thing to go through in terms of being someone who even puts your hat in the ring in the first place in this day and age, knowing what it can mean for the way that your family and friends can get attention. Is American politics something that you are sort of done with, or is it something where you feel like there's a future where you could make a comeback?
Oh yeah, I'm certainly not done. My experience was certainly brief, but full of passionate intensity. I think I personally am not turned off by it. I mean, it was sad to see some of my colleagues do the mental calculation of just, where did they have to toe a certain line because they knew the pressure might be too much for their family. My wife and I are expecting our first, actually about 2 weeks, but I'm blessed to have a very stubborn and strong wife who doesn't look at, negative criticisms or even, when things spill over from social media into kind of real world threats. If anything, we kind of find that galvanizing. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I had somebody compare being a politician or an elected official to being in the eye of the hurricane. You experience something, but it's really nothing compared to those around you who are getting hit by the wall. Mm-hmm. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that causes a lot of really good people to decide not to get in. It maybe has a perverse incentive in terms of some people loving that fight and wanting to get in. And very little of that has any cross-pollination with just doing the actual job, as opposed to, all of the brand building and celebrity status that too many get thrilled by.
Are you fully prepared for your first?
Well, having spent 3 years between Iraq and Afghanistan, my biggest lesson in both of those was whatever expectations I had going in, you can only prepare so much. War? Well, by which I mean, you can be as well prepared, but that maybe only gets you 20%. So much is going to be on the job.
Until you get punched in the face.
Exactly. So it's helpful to have a plan. We have a plan. I feel good about our plan, but Semper Gumpy.
How have you set up the nursery? Is it all good? Everything put together?
Oh yes.
Did you do it yourself, or did you thumbtack anything?
Totally self-reliant there. It's like IKEA furniture. It's not hard. None of this is complicated.
Are you? I'm just curious because we've done it, and we have a 2.5-year-old and a 3-month, almost 3-month old. What is your plan when it comes to sleep? Are you going to be the night person? Are you going to shift off? What's the way that you're approaching that?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, well, this is also the benefit of not having a job right now, right? And having a wife who has a job with maternity leave. Eventually there's going to be a rhythm that's going to be found, right? Yeah. And I think I'm confident that my wife and I will be able to balance that. We've kind of worked out, okay, what are the co-sleeping arrangements? How are we going to do that? If it becomes sort of a colicky situation, then, is there a need to kind of have a sleeping location that maybe is sufficiently distant to not be drowned out by the cries of a poor child for the parent who is off duty? And but we haven't worked out those schedules yet.
Last question before I get back to politics. Have you any clues as to the mood of the baby? And by that I just mean, has it been like an active kicker, an active baby, or is it more sedate? Is it a little more calm in the womb? Because that is, having now experienced both things, that is the way they come out. In the sense that if they're active, then they're active, and if they're calm and kind of cozy than they are more that.
Well, and this is the challenge, right? Is I don't have a baseline against which to compare the activity. So I'm hoping normal degrees of activity that don't necessarily carry over into hyperactivity on the flip side, once out of the womb. But certainly, certainly plenty of roles, plenty of
our first daughter was running a marathon every day, and our second daughter just wants to be calm and cozy. So
I don't blame them.
Marked difference.
I mean, that's probably the most comfortable moment any of us are going to face. So
yeah. I know that it's one of these things where you've had all of these different experiences in your life to this point, but it has to be incredibly infuriating to see this report put out by the White House last week. A week ago today, when we're recording this interview, dumped before a holiday weekend about what went down in Afghanistan. I know that this is an issue that is important to you personally, something that you care about, and obviously, have played an active role in terms of the policy arena. What are your thoughts on what the White House put out, what the general consensus is about how things played out in the Afghanistan exit, and what lessons you took from it?
I mean, I'll just start by saying this is actually one of the rare issues where I'm very, very grateful for the mainstream media and the fact that journalists writ large across the political spectrum have shown almost no interest in carrying the Biden administration's water on this, in marked contrast to plenty of other issues. But and part of that I think was informed during the withdrawal. Especially larger news organizations that had an international bureau, this wasn't some distant, far off incident that was totally removed from them. I mean, many of those reporters had rotated through Afghanistan. They knew, they had gotten to know and befriended the local nationals who had worked for their organization, either as fixers, as drivers, as local journalists. And so, they were hearing in real time from folks who were experiencing it in real time, in contrast with just the whitewashing or the delay of providing good information, or the attempts to downplay the severity of what was occurring that was happening every day in the White House briefing room. And I mean, this NSC report that was put out, this was not this is not a document meant to be, enduring in the historical record. This was a political response because the administration needed to try to shift the narrative away from their own culpability and responsibility for how the withdrawal was executed, and try to pin it on the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. And I was grateful to see that almost universally it was panned, but especially by folks who understood that, not just journalists or those in the political arena, but a lot of my friends who are in the political science, kind of international relations, those who were bona fide experts on the country, and had been studying it for, and the American involvement for, over a decade, just like, what the hell is this thing? Mm-hmm. And I saw this firsthand in both closed door briefings and open hearings on the Hill. The incredibly simplistic, And I was frustrated by some of my Republican colleagues who just said, well, it was all Biden's fault, and that's the start and finish of it. And then the Democrats just saying it was all Trump's fault, and that was the start and finish of it. And I mean, the reality is much more complicated, and we can debate the merits of withdrawing, but there is no question that the execution of this withdrawal will go down as one of the greatest indicators of our institutional incompetence and duplicity from a public relations and communication standpoint, and the inability. Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, I think 2.5 weeks ago, said he had no regrets with how this withdrawal was executed, and also that nobody had been held accountable in any way, shape, or form, and that he didn't see a need for there to be accountability. Now, contrast that with some of our NATO allies, the Dutch, right? I had a meeting with with an individual from the Dutch Foreign Ministry and another from the Dutch Ministry of Defense, where notably in the weeks that followed the withdrawal, both their defense minister and their foreign minister resigned in shame because they left behind, several dozen individuals who had been interpreters for them. And that was an outrage, and the Dutch demanded accountability. And they asked me in this meeting, they're like, "Oh, do you think there will be accountability on the American side?" And I looked at my watch, it was 4:45. I didn't have any other meetings for that day. And I was like, I can't have this conversation without some whiskey in my hand, because it's just, but it's, I would respect the individuals, and even short of folks resigning, I would have so much more respect for members of this administration if they said, "Listen, we made mistakes. Mm-hmm. We should have done this better. We should have prepared better on this end. We should have started the evacuation sooner. We missed these signals. And here's what we're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again." But we're not getting any of that. It's, "What are you talking about?" John Kirby saying, "I didn't see any chaos. That wasn't my..." It's like, now is Biden going to go back and be like, "Actually, the crowd size at my inauguration was a historic record too"? It'd be one thing. I don't know. It depresses the hell out of me.
Well,
and I think
this is what you mentioned a couple of times, something that I think is so important here. I talk a lot on my podcast and in other contexts about the decay of American faith in institutions. And, I think that a lot of times people will just, go back to the trope of sunlight is the best disinfectant. But the reason that it's a best disinfectant is if there is accountability for what that sunlight reveals. In our current status, I think that what we actually have is we don't have enough sunlight, but then when we get it, there aren't any consequences for it. Nobody loses their job. Nobody gets fired. Nobody gets reamed out in front of a hearing. And in the rare instances where that does happen, we've seen a little bit of that with Rand Paul's treatment of Anthony Fauci, and a couple of other incidences here and there. John Kennedy, interviewing some of these judicial nominees who don't know, don't seem to be able to remember how many amendments there are in the Constitution, that kind of thing. But the thing that I think is so telling is that, there are no consequences in today's Washington. Nobody gets fired. Nobody has to fall on their sword. They just stick it out. They just put their heads down and they endure. And that, I think, is actually the thing that Americans can't stand, because they know that if they screwed up to that degree in their place of work, they would be fired. And Washington just seems immune to that. How does that change? What do we do to change that? How do we change to a point where the administrative state is not, essentially immortal life for all of these bureaucrats?
Yeah, and I'll go one further and say the threat or the fear of that accountability also helps on the front end. Folks say, we need to get this right, because if we don't, heads are going to roll. If we don't, there's going to be a congressional investigation. It's all going to be ripped out in the open. But if they know that, if they're a Democrat and it's a Democratic administration, by and large, the media will, carry a lot of water for them, generally speaking. Again, this being a rare exception to that. Mm-hmm. But there's also, I think, there's this bet that's being placed on the attention span of the public, that by the time the truth comes out, by the time the lie is revealed to be what it is, or the spin is revealed to have been as empty and threadbare as it was, that folks will have moved on. And, you see this just in the balloon, the Chinese spy balloon, right? There was anonymous sources say that X, Y, and Z wasn't able to see, look, we're fine. 6 months later or 6 weeks later, actually, that wasn't the case. That was totally a lie, right? But I'm more critical. Not that the right bears responsibility, but I get frustrated on the right, partially because we can do so much better if we, the Afghanistan withdrawal. If the notion that, we left $85 billion worth of equipment behind. So $85 billion is the total amount of military support, including training and assistance, for the Afghan security forces over the entire 20-year war. It was definitely several $billion worth of equipment. But if the attack is exaggerated then the Democrats and the Biden administration say, well, that's not accurate, that, blah, 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 without addressing the underlying substance.
It gives them an easy out.
It gives them an easy out. And now I think,
So let me ask you, though, about what can be done about this, because this is, one of my frustrations is that, Congress has ceded so much of its power, its unwillingness to use its power over the purse in ways that are targeted or that are designed to create some kind of consequence or change, has been well demonstrated. What can the Congress actually do to make oversight in these areas have some real teeth? I mean, it just seems like in the absence of that, this only continues to get worse. We continue to see situations where, as you said, under a Democratic administration, Democrat-leaning bureaucrats get away with things. The media carries water for them, and there's no, ultimate consequences, and there's nothing on the front end either in terms of, feeling like we have to get this right or there's going to be consequences for this. I mean, I think back to the Obamacare launch and how disastrous that was in terms of just making a functional website, and you didn't have consequences for that at that time either. There really were not, the kind of consequences that you would have liked to see. So whether it's trying to people get infuriated at a government when they feel like it's asleep at the wheel. And, we just had this example of, of all things, apparently, a Massachusetts, Air National Guard guy, going on Discord and leaking things not out of some ambitious, attempt to change policy like Edward Snowden did or something like that, but just out of wanting to impress his buddies on the list. At least that seems to me to be the read of it. That kind of thing just makes people lose faith in these institutions that we need to have faith in. So how can Congress exercise the power that it ought to be able to have under the Constitution in ways that will lead to better behavior by these institutions?
Well, first and foremost, you need to right the imbalance, as you pointed out, the imbalance between the president and the executive branch and Congress and the legislative branch. And I think it's really acute when it comes to war powers and when it comes to our military and conflict operations. The war in Afghanistan, the legal grounding for all of that activity was in the 2001 authorization for use of military force. And I know some of my colleagues just want to flat out repeal it. I think there are some necessary authorities that we need to have renewed. But the idea that for the past 2 decades, not a single member of Congress has had to place an up or down vote. And by the way, before you get to that vote, you don't have substantive committee hearings. You don't have members asking questions. And most importantly, you don't have the Department of Defense having to articulate an answer to those, having to sharpen those pencils, because they need to provide those members with the confidence that they will place a good vote and an informed vote in that moment, right? So when you break down that entire system, you still have members who are interested, on the margins, right? You still have, the occasional hearing around war powers and authorities, but you don't have members who say, I need to understand this, and I need the Department of Defense to convince me of their strategy and what they're doing for me to continue to cast a vote in support of this, right? So when Congress takes its hands off the wheel and just lets the DOD operate on autopilot, we can make large changes after a catastrophe or an outrage, but we aren't able to make the course corrections that prevent that catastrophe in the first place.
You effectively end up with 5-minute speeches from Tulsi Gabbard and Thomas Massie, and then it goes away. That's not a way for Congress to function. That's not doing your jobs. One of the things that looking back at the history of Congress and paying attention to some of the different changes that were made over the years, I'm curious as to your attitude toward one specific thing that was done. Back in the 94 revolution that Newt Gingrich led, one of the things that was so key about that contract with America that people tend to forget is that most of the changes they made were kind of internal functional things, about the ways that staff was paid and committees were funded and a bunch of other things that, didn't actually have to do with kind of big picture things. People think about the contract or think about things like that as being like big top line issues. And instead, no, it was institutional reform shifts that they made. One of the things that is a consequence of that we still live with today is that congressional staffs and the budgets associated with them are pretty small, especially when you're dealing with, the amount of issues that every member has to deal with. Do you think that we need to expand those budgets, both to retain good staffers, prevent them from having to go, get paid by K Street in order to send their kids to college, and also to kind of right the ship when it comes to the relationship that you have with bureaucrats, where, so much of this business of actually writing legislation is almost outsourced to the entities themselves as opposed to something that's done internally by staff?
Oh, I think without question. One of the things that happened in the 1994 revolution was also diminishing some of the institutional capacity, not just on the staff side, not just on the committee side, but also, entities like the Congressional Technology Office were done away with. I think of how much more effective Congress would have been just on the defense and national security side of the House if Congress had its own intelligence analysis bureau. So you had people who were whose job was it to do analysis rather than trusting the analysis that's done by the executive branch, where there's going to be a strong incentive not to put forward a finished product that may contradict what the public statements are of your boss's 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 boss, right? So Congress is really it's especially true on the classified realm, but generally speaking, Congress is very much dependent on the executive branch to provide the information that we need in order to make a determination on whether the executive branch is doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And if the executive branch is both writing the legislation when it comes to rules and the rulemaking authority administratively, right? They're crafting much of that policy. And then they're also the ones who are providing Congress with the data. It's no surprise that we've gotten to a point where you have such an unaccountable bureaucracy. And, I'm very firmly of the belief that for every additional dollar that you put into Congress that they can put into the legislative function of oversight, right? For every dollar you put in there, you could probably take away $10 or $100 from the executive branch. And it's, I don't know what the actual ratio is, but legislative versus executive employees in this country,
you may not know what that ratio is, but it's there. Yeah.
Yeah. It's obscene.
So you mentioned something there that I wanted to get to next, which is the trust level with the intel community. Broadly speaking, intel law enforcement has been something that really within the last 7 or 8 years has completely flipped in terms of Republican voters' attitudes toward it. Obviously, that's mostly due to the treatment of President Trump, but it's not just due to that. It's also, it seems to me, due to kind of the weaponization of this whole area against Republicans generally. The work of people like Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell and people along those lines who have, used this as like a partisan brickbat when it was traditionally treated as being something where, look, as much as we might fight on the networks, as much as we might disagree about policy, when we get into these rooms where we're being shown the most important information in the world and the threats that America is facing, we take off our red and blue ties and we actually, behave like citizens and like gentlemen. And so I realize that's an old-fashioned way of thinking about this, but it's really important. How do we get back to the point where both Americans, particularly the Republicans whose distrust has risen under this period, can trust these institutions again? And how do we do it in a way that makes it clear that we can't ever go down the road of having this type of intel community, law enforcement community weaponization against an opposing candidate? I can only imagine the treatment that the Bush-Cheney administration would have gotten if they had engaged in that kind of behavior against Barack Obama, and it would have been, just absolutely a travesty. And yet, when it comes to this, it seems like because Trump is so unique and because he, has so many different foes and causes so much beef with so many people. He likes to fight with everyone at once. That we now are reaching this point where people don't trust the CIA, they don't trust the FBI, they don't trust these people who we need to be able to trust in order to keep us safe. How do we change that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with those organizations not giving so much grist for the mill, right? Like, yeah. I mean, I think some of the criticism is exaggerated, but there is incredible amounts of valid criticism of the way the FBI has conducted itself. I mean, especially when you look towards their actions around any number of domestic security incidents, and if you have then an inability to, and I don't like the phrase both sides, but I love pointing out this is not one side on many of these issues, right, may be a little bit more to blame, but there is so much blame to go around that we end up in these scenarios where Schiff and Swalwell will say, well, yeah, I mean, we weaponized the House Intelligence Committee and would go on TV and say, well, I can't tell you about all the classified things because I can't betray confidences, but just know that Donald Trump is guilty, right? They would make those illusions. Now, it would be a lot, and then that also forces many of those institutions into a really awkward position. I mean, James Comey with Hillary Clinton was probably the perfect example, where now they're in the best of worlds, they're trying to avoid the political spotlight, but they're getting dragged into it, and then they're fumbling. They're doing a poor job. In the worst of worlds, they are maybe more primed to believe the worst of somebody who's their political adversary and more willing to give a pass to those who are on their own team. I think if there was more transparency across the board, I mean, you talk about the classified documents that this Maryland Air National Guard airmen put out. We both have too many things that are classified in government, many of which are oftentimes classified, not because it's that sensitive, but because they're trying to avoid external consequences. They're trying to avoid criticism. If we had a better pairing of that, if there was more accountability for folks who didn't give Congress the documents it needed, which, I mean, it's a bad dynamic. But a little bit of that is on members of Congress themselves and on folks to not fan flames in ways, because if I'm a member of the intelligence community and I know if I put something out, it's not going to be read by serious and sober people, then they start to hold things back. Then you have more screw ups. Like, we're in so many of these doom loops where, you kind of just have to say, all sides need to exhibit some restraint. There needs to be some, self-policing. I'm very sympathetic to, saying, listen, this was dished out to us. We're going to dish it back. And then can we come to an agreement that we're not doing this anymore? Right. Speaker McCarthy did that with ejecting folks from committees, after Nancy Pelosi did that, and then had a sit down and say, let's have a code of conduct so that we concretize what these rules are so people know them in advance. Yeah.
That's something I know. I was interviewing Nancy Mace, and I know that's something that she cares about a great deal. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting about this is there's this incentive in place to get on, and this is something that Trey Gowdy and I talked about recently, to get on TV, to get on prime time, to make your point and basically be a hype man for your side of the aisle. That's something that, as a member of Congress, seems to be a bigger and bigger part of the job as they're treating it. I don't like that. Not just because it competes with my own airtime, but because I think that it's one of these things where that's not what they sent you to do. That's not what you're there for. It helps you raise money, but it's not the actual job that you're supposed to be doing.
Well, and the problem there too is when Congress doesn't do its job, because we have taken away so much power and responsibility from it, it can be hard to tell when Congress is truly screwing up. Right. And I'm not talking about the media portrayal. I mean, American citizens feeling the consequences of sending the wrong people to Washington, D.C. Now, there are certainly consequences, right? I mean, look at inflation as a consequence of a lot of the deficit spending during the Biden administration, the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, all of those pieces of legislation that just poured more cash, onto the inflationary fire, right? But it can be very hard because we have so much of that removed. It can be hard to hold folks responsible for the consequences of the actions they undertook, which means it's very easy for them to blame somebody else and to pass that buck. Right. And then that just perpetuates that cycle. There's a lot of folks when I say we need to make Congress more powerful, we need to make that a much more significant entity in our federal government. Like, well, look at Congress. It's a joke. It's a laughing stock. Yeah. Exactly. It's that way because it can be that way. Mm-hmm. Congress can be an absolute farce, and we can't really tell the difference. And if you could tell the difference between, those members who are serious and sober in doing something and those who are just, don't even have legislative staffers, they're purely communications oriented. If that was felt in the district, then they would make a change to who they were sending forward. But if your idea of effectiveness of a member is how often you see them on your favorite cable program, then that's going to tilt the incentives in the way that it has.
So I want to ask you, with the time we have left, about just kind of the general direction of the conservative cause in the country. Obviously, conservatives made peace with, or essentially came to support Donald Trump during his rise and afterwards, even though he did so as someone who had espoused a lot of views that were not conservative at all. Mm-hmm. They made their peace with him, and they even, worked with him, despite, in some cases, being someone who was personally insulted by him, such as, people like Ted Cruz. They've figured out kind of a way to navigate it. Now, though, they face a real decision about whether they want to go through this whole rodeo again. Mm-hmm. And the 2024 nomination battle certainly seems like one where, as I've been saying for months, Trump is the likeliest nominee. That being said, there does seem to be concern that this is a moment historically in America where people would like to shift to a new generation. We've had 3 presidents born in the same year. We have a president now who's older than all 3 of them. Mm-hmm. And it's one of these things where, people just kind of are feeling like, can we move on from this baby boomer stuff? Is that even possible? Obviously, Kevin McCarthy being, the only younger sort of leader in the current Congress in terms of his approach as in opposition to the Pelosi, Schumer, McConnell kind of dynamic. Do you think that we're actually at a point where people are eager enough to move to a younger potential leader for the Republican Party? Or do you think that the dominance that Trump has shown in terms of his political forays, within the primary context at least, is going to prevent that?
I mean, I don't want to make common cause with folks who just want to return to the pre-Trump GOP, right?
Sure.
Because that was a listless, lacking in energy. It certainly had wins, right? I don't want to discount some of those wins, but it didn't necessarily pivot away from, or it was not something that a rising generation could feel excited about.
Yeah.
Right? And I reject fully the dynamic that we either the Trump era was perfect and there's nothing we should change, or the pre-Trump era was perfect and we just need to get back to that. Like that is just not a good dichotomy.
That's revisionist history.
Yeah. But at the same time, I am deathly fearful of generational unified democratic control of our government. And I think that would be massively destructive. We've already seen what that has done to us economically through inflation. Mm-hmm. And imagine what the response to a global cataclysm economically, right? If we went into a new Great Depression, what total erasure of the free market, total erasure of any institutions that were not governmental from this country would do to us in the long term, right? That scares the hell out of me. Mm-hmm. And in order to prevent that, you need Republicans who can win competitive elections, right? You need Republicans who can take back, well, we have taken back the House, but it's a perilous majority. Yeah. We need to be able to take back the Senate. We need to be able to take back the White House. And I think my frustration on the right is that we should have plenty of room for policy disagreements, but you probably shouldn't be actively telling people not to vote for you or actively trying to eject people from your party. Yeah. I mean, we've seen in Arizona, that was just not the smartest strategy, right? It turns out, it turns out that you need more votes than the other person, and if you tell the other person,
it turns out in a state where there's like an insanely huge population of independents, that it's not a good idea to tell people not to vote for you.
Yeah, but the other reality is you have folks and you have Republicans in our political process for whom winning and actually having the burden and responsibility of governing is less favorable to their personal prospects, is a less tantalizing proposition than sort of the consequence-free realm of being in the minority. The worse things get, great. The more angry people will get, the more fundraising I can do, the bigger the brand I can build. Right. So yeah. I have, that is something we should fundamentally be rejecting, folks who at the end of the day do not care about points on the board and do not care about being able to take office, and also thinking not just, what am I saying to kind of get my base excited? How am I going to preach the best to my choir? But always keeping in mind that marginal voter, because those are the people who are deciding whether or not you're going to win or lose. And in my mind, I want to be able to persuade that marginal voter who maybe is coming into it disagreeing with me. And if I can change their mind, great. If I can get them to say, well, you know what, we don't see eye to eye, but like, I trust this individual and I trust how they're approaching the situation, right? That's how you're going to win. Maybe not those elections where the primary is the only battle because it's a safe seat. Democrats have done this on their redistricting side. Republicans have done this on the redistricting side. We had in 2000 out of the 435 House seats, 160 of them were within, a 10-point, kind of presidential result. It went from 160 to 60 in this current redistricting cycle. And that is only going to mean that when the Democrats are in charge, they're going to go even further to an extreme. And if we can't get to the point where we are in charge of more than just one branch, we're going to be run roughshod over, and we can expect more of the same. I'm not satisfied with that. And I think if there were members of the older generation in the party who felt as passionately about ultimate victory in a general election, I would be more than happy to enthusiastically back them. But I do think it's time for folks to step up and say, we need folks who are going to be alive to see the consequences of the decisions that they're making today.
I am very interested in getting back to the point where the coalition of the right isn't talking about, flipping things based on stuff, battles within the 40-yard lines. Like, I want to see them say, no, we can win 40 states. We can win 40 states if we do this the right way, and get back to that, as opposed to just, just giving up on the idea that a true majoritarian approach is not one that they can pursue. I don't believe it, and I think that it's a very limited vision to just keep battling back and forth in that narrow space.
I agree.
Peter, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
It was a pleasure, Ben. Thank you.